In the late 19th century, European powers were in a fierce scramble for control over the vast and resource-rich continent of Africa. This era, known as the Scramble for Africa, saw European nations vying to expand their empires by claiming African territories. The culmination of this imperialist competition was the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, a meeting that would shape the future of Africa in profound and often devastating ways. Remarkably, not a single African representative was invited to the table where the fate of their lands and people was decided. Background: The Scramble for Africa. By the late 1800s, European nations were competing for influence and resources across the globe. Africa, with its vast mineral wealth, fertile lands, and strategic locations, became a primary target for colonial expansion. Prior to the Berlin Conference, European incursions into Africa were mostly limited to coastal trading posts and a few isolated settlements. However, as technological advancements made inland exploration more feasible, the race to claim African territories intensified. This unregulated competition led to conflicts between European powers, as well as brutal exploitation and violence against African communities. To avoid direct military confrontations among themselves and to formalize their claims, the European powers sought to establish rules for the colonization of Africa. The Berlin Conference, dividing a continent. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European countries and the United States gathered in Berlin at the invitation of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The purpose of the conference was to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa. Over the course of several months, these diplomats and leaders carved up the African continent into territories that would be controlled by the various European powers. The key decisions made at the Berlin Conference included principle of effective occupation. European powers were required to establish authority in the areas they claimed. This meant building infrastructure, establishing administration, and maintaining a military presence. Free trade zones. The Congo Basin and Niger River regions were designated as free trade zones where all European nations could operate without interference. The Congo Free State. King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal control over the Congo Free State, a decision that would lead to one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history. As a result of the conference, borders were drawn with little regard for the existing ethnic, cultural, and linguistic divisions among African peoples. Entire communities were split between different colonial powers, while rival groups were forced together under artificial borders. The European powers prioritized their own economic and political interests, disregarding the complex social and political landscapes of the African continent. The absence of African voices. One of the most glaring injustices of the Berlin Conference was the complete exclusion of African representatives. The decisions made during the conference were based entirely on European perspectives, with no consideration for the wishes or rights of the African people. The conference essentially legitimized the theft of African land and resources, setting the stage for decades of exploitation and oppression. African leaders and communities were left to deal with the consequences of decisions made thousands of miles away, with no say in the process. The arbitrary borders drawn by the European powers would lead to numerous conflicts and tensions in the following decades, many of which continue to affect Africa today. Aftermath and legacy. The Berlin Conference had a profound and lasting impact on Africa. By 1914, nearly 90% of the continent was under European control. The arbitrary borders and colonial administrations imposed by the European powers disrupted traditional societies, economies, and governance structures. The legacy of these borders can still be seen in the modern map of Africa, where many of the political boundaries established during the Berlin Conference remain in place. The exploitation of Africa's resources and people during the colonial period led to immense suffering and stunted the continent's development. The Berlin Conference is often cited as a symbol of the injustices of colonialism and the destructive impact of European imperialism on Africa. A continent divided. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 stands as a stark reminder of the power dynamics that have shaped global history. The division of Africa, without the presence of a single African voice, illustrates the deep disregard for the sovereignty and humanity of African peoples by the European powers. The conference set the stage for decades of colonization, exploitation, and conflict, the effects of which are still felt across Africa today. The story of the Berlin Conference is not just a historical event. It is a crucial chapter in understanding the complex legacies of colonialism and the ongoing struggles for self-determination, justice, and unity in Africa.